Good morning, everyone. I'm glad to see that most of you have returned for yet another edition of History 105. Last week I provided an overview of the tragic events surrounding A prime virus, also known as the superflu, also known as tube neck, also known as Captain Trips. We covered a lot of that tragedy that occurred on the summer of 1990, detailing not just the massive loss of life, but also the social chaos that erupted across the continents. Our focus, of course, being on North America. During my office hours the last few days, many of you have come to me and you have asked me about something that is sometimes called the second culling, also known as the second epidemic. So today I am going to explain what that means. The working theory is that after the first 2 weeks of the virus rampaging across America, about 99.6% of the U.S. population was wiped out. By the arrival of July 4th, 1990, the U.S. population has declined from 250 million to around 1.2 million. But during that 2-week period, from the end of June until the middle of July, something was happening. By the middle of July, that number, 1.2 million, drops down by 16%. So there's now barely just over 1 million people still alive within what we used to call the United States. So if the virus did not kill the men, women, and children of this 16% of this second epidemic, how did they die? The list is long. Accident, starvation, dehydration, injury, manslaughter, infection, animal attacks, exposure. There are countless reasons, but it mostly boils down to one root cause of death: a complete lack of community. But for today's class, I don't want to spend a lot of time over-examining the crumbling global politics, or even the covert operations of the secret military compounds we touched upon last class. Today, I want you to see, to witness some of these human faces. These are all people that died before any of us were born. And so, without further ado, I would like you to look into the faces of the fallen, the victims of the second epidemic. Professor Gina McCone, who some of you I know you know very well, is the founder of Project Memory. This is a volunteer movement with one goal: to collect the stories of the fallen. In the aftermath of the Great Plague, with countless bodies filling up the hospitals, churches, and apartment complexes, the survivors had a health crisis on their hands. Thousands of exposed corpses meant that there was potential for even more disease. Needless to say, the volunteer crews in charge of corpse disposal didn't have the time or the energy to play the role of anthropologist. In so many ways, the founders were lucky to arrive in Boulder. I know many students here today probably had parents that told you while you were growing up that it was divine providence that guided the founders to Mother Abigail, and that the arrival in Boulder had nothing to do with luck or happenstance. But I would like to, at least for now, save the theological implications for another class. What I guess I want to point out to you is that Boulder, of all the cities in this country, happened to have the fewest corpses per square mile. And that is because early on in the panic stages of the Great Plague, or Captain Trips, a rumor spread that there was a deadly chemical cloud moving through Colorado. News outlets picked up on this rumor and fanned the flame, so to speak. And before the end of June, there was a mass exodus from Boulder. And so that's why I say it was fortunate for the founders of the Free Zone, because, true, they had to remove thousands of bodies from various buildings, but in any other city this size, they would have had to have removed hundreds of thousands. Now, Dr. Gina witnessed the macabre undertakings firsthand when she was a little girl. She's told me on more than one occasion how she used to ride her bike up and down the streets of Boulder all by herself, actually not too far from our campus. And on one day, she noticed about a dozen men wearing slipshod hazmat gear, and they were loading human remains into the back of a truck. And at first, Gina thought that she was witnessing these men just carrying mannequins because the limbs were so stiff from rigor mortis. And then it dawned on Dr. McCone that each one of those bodies, being carried out like trash, had once been a person with likes and dislikes, friends and relatives, hopes and fears, each person with hundreds of stories lost forever, unless, of course, someone wanted to take the time and look, investigate, find that person's story. And that is precisely what Gina has done with Project Memory. Thanks to her, when the Free Zone borders finally began to spread east and west, north and south, people made a concerted effort to find and recover information about the fallen. Most of these narratives I offer you today are the result of a dedicated and all-volunteer staff led by the hard work of Dr. Gina McCone. Of particular interest to Project Memory are the lives and deaths of those who died during what we call the second epidemic, or more crudely, the second culling. They were people like George McDougall. He was a high school math teacher at Nyack High School. Nyack was a small town in the state of New York. At the beginning of 1990, its population was 6,558. But after the superflu, only 4 residents were left alive. George McDougall was one of those survivors, but sadly he did not survive for very long. His body was found on the corner of Oak Avenue and Pine Street. And again, all appearances indicated that he was immune. There was no sign of disease. No tube neck, no purple underneath the eyes, no vomit. Just a man in a jogging suit. But in his pocket, a wallet was discovered. The volunteers who recovered his body cataloged its contents, which included this photo of his family, his wife, and 11 children. Their names were written on the back of the photo, inscribed in tiny, nicely printed letters. We see Harriet, Patty, George Jr., Frank, Danny, Richard, Robert, Stanley, Bill, Helen, Marty, and Jeff. Every member of his family was taken by Captain Trips, and so it is believed that he began to jog as a way of dealing with his grief. One of the other town's few survivors was a 72-year-old woman, and she said that after everyone else had left or died, that George McDougall was the only living person that she had spotted. She had spotted him jogging just about every day, running through the streets littered with wrecked cars and decomposing dogs. Before the loss of his family, George McDougall had been an active member of St. Anne's Catholic Church, and at his work, he specialized in helping remedial students fall in love with math. And I wish I had known him, because God knows I could have used his help in geometry. George McDougall kept running one morning until his heart could no longer take it. It is on this corner, photographed here, where we believe a massive heart attack ended his life. For right now, we're going to bid a bittersweet farewell to George McDougall. And we're going to look at the life of this person. This is Judy Horton. Before the A-prime flu, she was a high school cheerleader and a young mother. She grew up in Milltown, Kentucky. The body of 17-year-old Judy Horton was discovered in a walk-in meat freezer in the basement of her apartment complex. In the corner were the corpses of her young husband and son, Waldo and little Petey. The remains of the two males showed all the signs of the superflu. But Judy's body indicated no such signs of the virus. She had died of dehydration. At first it was thought that, like George McDougall, Judy could not bear to live without her family, and so a working theory was that she locked herself in the freezer. The power was shut off, by the way, so she did not freeze. It was probably room temperature in there at that time. And that would be, again, another bittersweet story of a survivor that just couldn't stand being alive with the rest of the family gone. However, when volunteers cleared out the apartment complex, they found this. It's Judy's diary. In these pages, Judy is venting about her disappointment in her husband and how she was angry that he was always focused on college instead of getting out and working a so-called regular job to support his family. Now, those entries are pre-June. The entries take a turn when Captain Tripp arrives, and Judy seems to take satisfaction in the demise of her own parents, and flat out rejoices at the death of her in-laws. Tear stains do wrinkle the page where she writes about her little boy succumbing to his illness. However, on the next page, she writes that she feels a lot better. And when her husband, Waldo, finally dies, she writes the word free over and over again, filling up the entire page. In the last pages of her diary, she writes about her so-called glory days as a cheerleader. She also lists the pros and cons of leaving her apartment and mentions a recurring dream about going to Las Vegas. But most disturbingly, she writes that she spent much of her free time visiting the bodies of her husband and son, making sure they were, quote, all settled in. So one day, probably in early July, she came down to the basement to spend time with her family's remains, and she accidentally locked herself in the freezer. We can see that there are scratch marks on the metal, presumably from her fingernails. So the first impression by the volunteers was a mistake. Judy did, in fact, not want to die. And neither did Arthur Stimson from Reno, Nevada. His body was found in the middle of a tiled lobby in Harrah's Casino. This was one of the later discoveries. With the radiation fallout from Vegas, it was a long time before Free Zone scouts ever dared to go in the Nevada area. Despite the passage of decades, it was relatively easy for volunteers to tell what happened to Mr. Stimson really at a glance. His skeleton was lying next to an assortment of medical instruments, cutlery, and hardware tools, as well as a stack of dusty books that were all on the same subject: surgery. A miter saw was still halfway through the bone of his ankle. We believe that he died trying to remove an injured foot that was probably turning gangrene. And obviously, the operation was not a success. I think we can all agree it was brave of him to try. Anyway, Project Memory got the man's name, and we learned that Arthur Stimson was a U.S. veteran who had served during the Vietnam War. He worked at the casino. Arthur loved remodeling automobiles. He entered photo contests, took a lot of pictures of cacti, and we found his name as one of the donors at the library in Reno, Nevada. Now, all of this put together, it is not much of an obituary. But keep in mind, there are countless victims of the second epidemic whose lives will remain a complete mystery. For example, volunteers found the remains of a 10-year-old girl. She was out on the street, her skull cracked against a curb. A rusty old bicycle was perched upside down next to the body. We don't know who she was. Was she pedaling towards Mother Abigail in Nebraska? We can only guess. There is also no way of identifying the desperate young man who died just outside of the Eisenhower Tunnel. My father and his friends were actually the ones to find the body that they named the Wolfman, so called because he had died fighting a pack of wolves. He had shot several of them, but one of them bit out his Adam's apple, and yet the man still somehow found the strength and the willpower to strangle the wolf to death with his bare hands. Their corpses were found tangled together in a gruesome embrace, still halfway out of the vehicle. We also don't know the name of the man that was discovered in this house, located in Grosse Pointe, an affluent city near Detroit. We do know who owned the house. It belonged to Aaron D. McFarlane, and the estate was a gift from his grandnephew, Allie McFarlane, who was one of the most notorious narcotics dealers in Michigan. But we don't think it was either one of those gentlemen, because the window was broken in. Therefore, it is believed that the dead man entered the house in search of heroin. And apparently he found it, because eventually a cleanup crew was going house to house, and the body of the man in question was found on the floor of the master bedroom. There was a syringe still piercing the leathery skin of the corpse just under the elbow. The body was face down in several bags of the drugs. And we are also not sure about the identity of the body who was discovered in this dilapidated stable. We know that the ranch belonged to the Kraslow family. That was a well-known ranching operation in Hardin County, New Mexico. So the body might have belonged to Milton Kraslow, or perhaps one of his sons, or some of his employees or ranch hands. What we do know is that a rattlesnake bit his hand, and he died from the venom. They found bandages on the corpse's hand, and they also found skeletal remains of a snake nearby that was skewered to the ground by a machete. So it looks like whoever this deceased rancher was, he managed to get his revenge before the end. I also like to believe that he was very good at animal husbandry, because against insurmountable odds, the scouts at this location found 5 mustangs and a foal, in spite of the fact that horses were just as susceptible to the virus as humans. It's in no small part thanks to this nameless rancher that horses have been brought back from the edge of extinction. We also do not know the name of the 5-year-old child who fell down this well. But I think about him every day. Because when I was a student, about the same age most of you are right now, Dr. McCone was my mentor. Now, she was just Gina then, and she was just getting Project Memory underway, and I wanted to help her. The well that you see right here, this was in the backyard of a woman named Hattie Reynolds. She was a plague victim, and she had no spouse and no children of her own. The well was hidden. This is in Georgia, by the way. The well was hidden by overgrown blackberry bushes, and I almost fell into this myself. I'm sure I would have if Gina hadn't pulled me back. And that is when we shined our flashlight into the dry well and saw bones about 20 feet below. Now, Dr. McCone, if you know her, then this doesn't surprise you. She always travels fully prepared for just about any situation, and about an hour later, I was the one that was wearing a helmet with a flashlight attached, and I was rappelling down to the bottom of this well. And I get to the bottom, and I come face to face with this tiny skull. This must have been a child of 4 or 5 years old, and its skeletal frame is sitting up. It's leaning against the mossy stone bricks of the well. The skeleton, I remember, it had frayed overalls. It was dressed like I say it was a boy. It might not have been, but there were also these tiny, sturdy work boots that you wouldn't expect a little child to wear, but he was. The legs were shattered. I think they were broken by the fall. And all of this led me to theorize that this poor little boy had, lost his parents to Captain Trips, and probably lost his brothers and sisters and grandparents too. So he was just all by himself. So he fell down the well. And I don't think the drop killed him. He didn't die instantly. He broke those little legs and then just sat there. I don't know for how long. And I thought about that down in that well. And I wish I could say that I collected the remains and brought them back to the surface, because that had been the plan. I really wanted to give this child a proper burial, but I panicked, which is funny when I think about it, because I had seen lots of dead bodies by this time, of course. You guys know, when you're a kid growing up in the outskirts of the free zone and beyond, it's hard, not to bump into an old corpse once in a while. You can't even play a game of hide and seek without tripping over a rib cage. But down in the well, this was different. There was something about those eye sockets. And so I got out of there as fast as I could. And Gina understood. And it was eventually decided. We kind of knew that the well needed to be filled for safety reasons. And so we decided that we would bury the boy's remains that way, down there. And so that's what we did. But we did make sure that we put a gravestone. And that grave is still in the ground where that well used to be. And it says just one word: child. Now, if we had time and inclination, we could look at hundreds and hundreds of more of these cases. But for now, let's look at one last person. And for this one, we do know her name: Irma Fayette. She was 26 years old at the time of her death. She lived by herself in Lodi, California, another town that was virtually wiped out. But one of her neighbors was also a survivor, and that man eventually made his way to Boulder. And he was able to verify some of these details that I'm going to mention to you. He confirmed that Irma had lived in this small and quaint house that we see here all of her life. She was sharing it with her mother until 1985, when her mother died of a stroke, after which Irma became even more reclusive. Her neighbors apparently understood that Irma just did not like people. And so most people simply stayed away from her. So when the superflu removed over 99.4% of the population, it makes you wonder, was Irma Fayette sad about the epidemic, or was she ecstatic? Whatever the case, it did not relieve her fear of other people, because one day in early July of 1990, Irma sat on her porch. She had a book titled "Satan is Alive and Well on the Planet Earth," and she also had a gun. Now, maybe she hoped that she was the last living person in the world, but coming down the street was her neighbor, very much alive and quite a bit tipsy, but also quite glad to see another survivor. Irma, however, was not glad. She picked up her .45 caliber pistol, pointed it at the man without saying a word, and fired. But the bullets in that gun were probably old and definitely improperly stored because the pistol exploded in her hand. Shrapnel went straight into Irma's brain, and she dropped dead on the porch. Much to the shock and agony of the confused, drunken man who had hoped that he had just discovered a friend in this lonely world of Captain Trips. Now, some of you might look at the fate of Irma Fayette as no great loss. Some of you might say the same thing about Judy Horton, or the dead man with the needle in his arm, that it is karma, poetic justice, a comeuppance, that it is no great loss. But each life that we've tried to imagine today was more than just a person. They were a potential. They could have been the roots of an entire family tree, but instead it withered away before it had a chance to grow. You see, each life and each death is a lesson. And if we are willing to pause and bear witness, to look, to investigate, when we do that, we learn that each lesson is a variation of the same theme. We need each other. The virus, and then the second epidemic, eliminated a society that was already breaking apart. It was a fragmented society that focused on hating the differences within itself, rather than acknowledging that we really had so much in common, that we shared so many of the same goals. Today, our free zone is not without its conflicts, far from it. But I truly believe that there are those of us living today that share a commitment to studying the mistakes of our past. And, by the way, I am including dedicated students of history such as yourselves within this group that I'm talking about. It is because of your willingness to face the truth. That is what gives me faith in the future. Well, I think we've looked into the faces of the fallen long enough for one morning. It looks like it is shaping up to be a lovely day, so why don't we end class a little bit early, and you can go outside and enjoy a bit of nature before your next lecture. I'm giving you a chance to do something that we don't do enough of as scholars of history. Go out and embrace the present.